Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Evelyn Welsh. I'm the Vice Principal for Arts and Sciences here at King's College London. And it's my enormous pleasure and privilege to chair tonight's inaugural by Professor Martin Stokes and to introduce him there. Martin Stokes is the King Edward Professor of Music here at King's, a truly distinguished chair in the institution. Martin Stokes is himself a distinguished interdisciplinary scholar, and I think the range of his audience already begins to demonstrate the extraordinary work that he does both here at King's and in his past. We have classicists, philosophers, social anthropologists, as well as ethnomusicologists and musicologists and musicians in the audience. So you, as friends of the institution, are very much a testimony to what we do here at King's. Martin himself first studied music and then social anthropology at Oxford, going on to teach at Queen's University Belfast from 1989 to 1997. And then he made the great leap over to Chicago, where he worked for a decade there. He then came back to Oxford in 2007 before sensibly deciding to come to King's in London in 2012 there. He was a Howard Foundation Fellow at the Chicago Humanities Institute in 2002. He's held visiting professorships in Istanbul on several occasions and holds an honorary professorship in the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. And in 2013, he gave the Block Distinguished Visiting Professorship Lectures at the University of California, Berkeley. So truly a distinguished international career there. Martin Stokes works on theorizations of emotion and cultural intimacy, and to date his work is focused on questions of ethnicity, identity, globalization, and the history of ethnomusicology and folk music study. He's worked on modern Turkey and Egypt with broader interests across the Mediterranean and Europe there. And now for a list of his prizes there. I'm keeping it short, I promise there, to cut out a few. His article on music and the global order won the Jaap Kunst Prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology in 2004. And his most recent book, The Republic of Love, Cultural Intimacy in Turkish Popular Music, published by Chicago University Press in 2010, won the Society of Ethnomusicology's Miriam Prize in 2010. And he was awarded the Dent Medal by the Royal Musical Association in 2010 and was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2012 there. We are truly delighted to have you here at King's, Professor Stokes. And to show that, there will be a reception after the lecture downstairs on the second floor in chapters, and Pelagia will show you the way there. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my delight to invite Professor Martin Stokes to deliver his inaugural lecture here at King's College London. Martin.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, for that very kind and warm introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's just, it's great to see you here. And for those of you from outside of King's, congratulations on finding your way up here in the first place, which is no mean feat, to the anatomy lecture. I can promise you that what you're about to hear has nothing to do with anatomy whatsoever. Thank you also to Pelagia Pais for the splendid organization for this, which has been wonderful. I've particularly taken by the tickets for the event, which has got a little picture of me on it, which made me kind of ponder what it must be like to have your face on a banknote or on a stamp. Not that I have any aspirations in that domain at all. The title of my inaugural lecture is Matters of Love and Justice in Music, and I'm going to be drawing on and reflecting on a project which is, I wouldn't say exactly nearing completion, but it's approaching a moment of gathering in that I've been working on pretty much over the last 2 years, perhaps a little bit more. So in this particular lecture, I'll be concentrating a little more on the justice side of the equation. But towards the end of the lecture, I'll try and situate that more broadly in the project as a whole. I think of all of the musicological subdisciplines, ethnomusicology has been the one that has perhaps had the most interest in and the most purchase on the question of social justice. Perhaps precisely because it's been such a pervasive background preoccupation, it's rarely been the object of foreground concern or theoretical inquiry beyond the relatively narrow domain and well-trodden domain of research ethics. But this is what I plan to do in this lecture, in part because it springs very naturally out of this long-standing interest I've had in sentimentalism in music, which goes back at least to my DPhil at Oxford on Turkish arabesque, going right back to the 1980s, in fact. My rather specific question for this evening is, in what ways might music be considered a practice of compassion? Or what problems come up, what issues come up when we do? The question is motivated for me by what has, I think, happened to love in European modernity. And here there are two kind of problems that particularly interest me and shape and kind of motivate the questions about social justice that I'm going to be concerned with. So let me explain a little bit. Love in the context of the 18th century cult of sentiment was conceptualized at the heart of a field of sympathy, motivating what we would now think of as some rather specific social justice issues, imagining the equality of citizens, arguing for the abolition of slavery, making space for women in the public sphere, promoting the, as Barker Benfield puts it, the democratization of pleasurable consumption. Such new understandings of love, of sympathy more generally, and love within it, were debated, as well as satirized and ridiculed at the time. Adam Smith was one of the first to see and think through what we might call the key sociological problem here, which is that lovers create bounded worlds and private languages. The affection that flows between them, in his view, is opaque, illegible, hard to grasp, and thus limited. For love to play a role in a broader conception of justice, according to Adam Smith, a third party is needed, the impartial spectator. Some principle, in other words, other than sympathy or love itself. Love, in the couple form, remains trapped in mutual regard, incapable of flowing outwards into the world in ways that would drive justice and order. By the 19th century in Europe, this anxiety had significantly grown, and the philosophical and aesthetic terrain had shifted. Sympathy disappeared as a principle of social ordering into the private sphere, while colonial expansion, ruthless competition, and muscular Christianity prevailed in public. Love was increasingly imagined as a scene of transgression, of overflowing, of excess, whose primary purpose was to allow the private self to grow and find completion and satisfaction. If one's spouse could no longer reliably provide uninterrupted service, then at least art and music could, and their core aesthetic task was increasingly conceived in these kinds of terms. So problem number one is quite simply the separation of matters of love from matters of social justice. Within this philosophical and sociological force field, European modernism wrought a split between two rather distinct representations of love. One about transgression, overflow, excess, psychically speaking in the service of the individual, oriented towards the universal and underwritten by the artwork. Another was about melancholy, shared tearfulness, emotional reflexivity, psychically speaking in the service of the couple, oriented towards the domestic towards hearth and home, and underwritten by mass media and commodity form. The split, as Terence Cave's recent study of the literary and musical cult of Mignon shows, took place surprisingly late and remains incomplete, contested, and unstable. But critically speaking, it shaped the negative understandings of sentimentalism that have interested me, and interested me partly because elite and intellectual disdain has been a very active ingredient in the mix of pleasures that quote-unquote sentimental genres supply. I've been concerned, as some of you may know, with entire genre fields shaped in this way. Argentinian tango, Portuguese fado, Turkish arabesque, dangdut and keroncong in Indonesia, country music in the States and elsewhere, música sertaneja in Brazil, and so forth. I've always tried to resist coming up with a checklist of features by which one might identify sentimentality in music. One can too easily find oneself reproducing the high cultural aesthetic norms. One can find oneself reproducing high cultural aesthetic norms in compiling such lists, and thus simply starting off in the wrong place, remote from the kinds of popular pleasures and engagements that interest me. Having said that, I chanced upon Ray Chow's book called Sentimental Fabulations, Contemporary Chinese Films, Attachment in the Age of Global Visibility, a book published in 2007. I came across it quite recently at a showing of Wong Kar-wai's wonderful and highly sentimental, I might say, film, In the Mood for Love, a film from 2000. Ray Chow provides just such a checklist of sentimental, as she puts it, situations in contemporary Chinese cinema, which I confess I found very useful. The list goes as follows: filial piety, domesticity, the preparation, consumption, and sharing of food, economic deprivation and social powerlessness, childhood and old age, the sight or knowledge of the exertion of physical labor, togetherness and separation, a preference for the familial, for social harmony and reconciliation, the passing of time, manifestations of nature, the, as she puts it, the preservation and continuation of the family line. The list, it seems to me, could easily be extended to music, whether in the service of narratives, in opera, operetta, music theatre, music video, film, or other media, or to song whose lyric or visual content focalizes such situations against the backdrop of such narratives. I would insist here in passing on the importance of narrative, which has not died the death many claim it has, and which is still as central to ethical life as it always was, even as I would want to acknowledge that sentimental narrative, reflexive, melodramatic, constantly stopping and starting to reflect on the emotionality of emotional moments, is a complex proposition. It's a point various people have made. Chow explores these situations in film aesthetics defined by dialectical movements between interiority and exteriority. But I find them readily convertible to my own preferred terms here, terms of, to use my kind of language here, of emotional scaling, of distribution, and of translation. Which is to say, I'm wanting to understand sentimentality primarily as an act of projecting emotion on the small scale, the scale of lovers, the scale of homestead, the scale of community, the scale of country. Secondly, I want to understand it as an act of distribution in social space, thus acts of apportioning emotion differently to men, women, children, old people, ethnic others, non-human actors, etc., etc. And thirdly, I want to understand it as an act of translation. In other words, acts that allow one to access, understand, and be in conversation on certain and highly qualified terms with the emoting of others. The translation, as it were, of sighs and groans across cultural space. In this broad project on musical sentimentalism, I've been interested in devising critical terms of reference in this kind of way that are historically and culturally in tune with the texts and themes that interest me, and that don't build alien and hostile viewpoints into the critical apparatus at the outset. And I've also been interested in thinking about how these acts of scaling or of small scaling, of emotional distribution and translation, both enable and also limit ethical and political mobilization. This is rather the opposite, or at least what I'm trying to do is rather the opposite of the prevailing picture, at least in ethnomusicology, where the moment of quote-unquote sentimentality in the life of a number of musical practices and genres, such as the ones that I described a moment ago, the moment of sentimentality is often identified as the moment the market, the commodity form, and the political status quo grabs hold of and neutralizes whatever forms of social critique might be contained within such practices. This is to exclude quite a lot in terms of global music making. So it may be worth spending a moment thinking about how ethnomusicology has configured, however implicitly, the question of music and social justice to understand the nature of this exclusion more thoroughly. So that's what I'm just about to do. But just to underline what I see as problem number two here is the intellectual denigration as sentimentalism of the cultural spaces, of the few cultural spaces, of the important cultural spaces where questions of love and social justice do flow naturally together. So, broader questions about social justice in ethnomusicology, how we've gone about thinking about it and approaching it, and where I see some of the problems to lie. Social justice issues in ethnomusicology, I would argue, can broadly and perhaps fairly conventionally be distinguished in terms of recognition issues and redistribution issues. Recognition here means the emotional affirmation and positive feedback we all require if we are to have an identity, a place from which we can securely and comfortably provide affirmation and feedback to others. The denial of recognition in these terms, the disparaging or simply ignoring of the experience of others, or the promotion of distorted understandings of them based on self-interest, act as limits on autonomy and selfhood. Democracy and social justice prevail accordingly to the extent that principles of recognition are systematic and evenly distributed across society, and able to square the circle of groups versus individual identities. This is not always easy, as when the recognition of group rights involves the curtailment of the autonomy and bodily integrity of particular members of those groups, the case of female circumcision being notorious. The field of social justice in this scenario is usually conceived in cultural terms. It's about cultural identities, systems of representation, language, and so forth. Redistribution means processes, usually enshrined by law, to counterbalance the effect of economic systems that marginalize and under-reward or ignore certain kinds of labor. The field of social justice in this scenario is usually conserved in terms of the economy, of the political. It's about exploitation, about labor versus capital, about equal access to public benefits, and so forth. For some, notably Axel Honneth, redistribution issues can and should be subsumed under a broader conception of recognition. Recognize people properly and systematically, and disparities in pay and the distribution of public goods will follow. For others, precisely the opposite is the case. Pay people equally, recruit fairly, ensure there are no glass ceilings, and people's worth will be recognized. Recognition follows here automatically from redistribution. For some, like Nancy Fraser, it makes sense to maintain a distinction between these two conceptions of social justice, precisely because a liberal democratic society now needs both. No amount of recognition, in her view, will compensate for the kinds of inequalities caused by global capitalism, the sudden collapse of local industries here, environmental degradation there, runs on currency markets somewhere else. Redistribution principles need to be deployed independently, in part because the scale of things is now such that sympathy, for example, for the plight of people whose factories have unexpectedly been closed, whose fishing waters have suddenly become polluted, or who wake up in the morning to discover their pension funds have been stripped, can no longer guarantee within the nation state that inequalities will be addressed. Sympathy no longer, as it were, is up to the task, according to people like Nancy Fraser. Similarly, no amount of redistribution will compensate for persistent failures to recognize the moral worth of others. Paying wages, better wages to a certain category of people for doing a particular job may simply serve to trap them in that occupational niche and thus reproduce the underlying social inequality. The debate goes on, and I don't really need to delve further into it for my particular argument at the moment, which is about how ethnomusicology has engaged questions of social justice, but I wanted just to set that up in the background. Now, whether in the music practices they study or reflecting on their own scholarly praxis, ethnomusicologists motivated by questions of social justice have tended to consider them in the light of either recognition principles or redistribution principles. The first is perhaps the easiest to illustrate, because the entire history of modern ethnomusicology might be understood as a demand for the recognition of all music lying beyond the Western canon. Disappearing and marginalized cultures must be protected, documented, archived, advocated for in the public sphere. The steamroller of Western culture and capitalism must be resisted. Colonial legacies must be contested. We must develop sensitivity to the subtle and complex ways in which our efforts to protect, document, archive, and advocate might perpetuate Western hegemony. In this broad context of enhanced and generalized musical recognition, we hope others might come to be taken for what they are, rather than what we want them to be, or what serves our particular interests or needs for fantasy, entertainment, amusement, etc., etc. Redistribution of resources follows on from this. Public funding for minority and global arts, jobs in the academic and conservatory systems, prizes and other forms of public recognition for musicians and artists from minorities and representatives of the global South. Now, the problem that we encounter, a familiar one, is the broad problem of multiculturalism, which, to be tenable and consistent, must become value neutral and thus always risk being thinly procedural, rigid, lacking in flexibility and creative energy. To have decided in advance that a prize committee or a festival space or a recording catalogue or a music curriculum is to be divided up in certain ways, containing certain elements, commits us to make certain a priori selections, to choose certain regions and repertories, to ignore others, to promote certain artists as representative voices, to ignore others, to package the loose assembly of elements that falls our way as a style, and thereby in all sorts of ways to commit ourselves to the preservation of that style, a creature of our own multicultural fantasy, though it may well be, and lacking in cultural legitimacy and energy outside of official administrative spheres. So one cannot proceed on the basis of substantive ideas about what a good multicultural society should look and sound like, musically or otherwise. Such conceptions of things would be described as teleological by critics like Nancy Fraser, committed by contrast to the view that multiculturalism can only ever be procedural and about making sure everybody is capable of competing for cultural space in the liberal democratic state on an equal footing. Ethnomusicologists who have been critical of multiculturalism, for example, in relation to the endless and ongoing debates about world music, are well aware of what the problems are. But most, I think it's fair to say, would have a hard time empathizing with or imagining an ethnomusicological version of this kind of procedural, bureaucratic multiculturalism. They aren't alone, of course. As Charles Taylor observed quite a long time ago in a classic essay, multiculturalism is caught on the horns of this dilemma. if too teleological, i.e. driven by an a priori idea of what elements make up the ideal multicultural mix, it risks arbitrariness, rigidity, and an entrenched unevenness of representation and recognition, and thus a problem viewed from a broader social justice perspective. If, on the other hand, it's procedural, people quickly find themselves bogged down in tedious bureaucratic exercises that are unlikely to generate energy, conversation, movement, excitement, i.e. the very things that make art and music a vehicle of authentic representation and recognition, and thus another kind of problem viewed from a broader social justice perspective. So we've got a long history in ethnomusicology. We've got a certain history in ethnomusicology of grappling with some of the problems on the recognition side of the social justice question. Questions about redistribution in ethnomusicology are less obvious, but no less important. Many ethnomusicologists have worked in communities that have suffered historical trauma, or that have experienced marginalization or neglect at the hands of the dominant power. Many have experienced or done their research in post-colonial situations in which the effort to right colonial wrongs has produced new kinds of maldistribution, as one ethnic group, say, comes to dominate the post-colonial political dispensation, a situation well discussed by ethnomusicologist Paul Berliner, thinking about the current dominance of the Shona people in Zimbabwe over the last 2 decades or so. Rewards in the form of patronage of musicians and thus attention outside the country fall disproportionately to one group at the expense of others. Many others have worked in situations in which northern metropolitan tastes dominate or come to exercise a disproportionate influence on music production in the global south. Kinds of systemic underdevelopment in the local production of world music genres have repeatedly been noted, along with the problems that arise when metropolitan tastes, for whatever reason, suddenly shift. Perhaps the most familiar redistribution scenario in ethnomusicology concerns the repatriation of cultural heritage, on which there's a growing literature and an accumulating tradition of thought. A growing number of academics have found themselves administering or working in close connection with large archival projects and recording projects that date from moments of colonialism or settlement in which there was little concern with or even conception of the rights of those from whom cultural artifacts and recordings were taken. The core ethical response has, on the face of it, been a simple and pretty basic one. Return objects in archives and museums, instruments, recordings, etc., to those from whom they were taken, or find other ways of putting these communities back in control of them. If this fails, find other ways, consider other ways of providing reparation, public apologies, for instance, and compensation. But as we know well by now, from people passionately committed to such redistributive acts, the practice is anything but simple. Western conceptions of ownership and property rights, already confused enough in relation to music, rarely translate clearly elsewhere. Here, the questions are very clearly and very directly about distribution, it seems to me, about making sure people from whom things were taken are given the opportunity to take back possession of them and to do what they will with them, to have rights to the profits that they generate, to have unfettered access to them for education and cultural projects within their own communities. The sense of social justice driving such concerns and such advocacy positions might usefully be described then as redistributive. Ethnomusicology is lucky to have within its ranks people who have worked in the music industry, in government, and in museums and public archives. And personally, I'm very grateful for and happy to see the ingenuity, thoughtfulness, and wisdom that have been brought to bear on them. But they can't always choose who they work with or how they work. Legal, institutional, and funding structures are not always conducive. Their terms and priorities are often quite different. The outcomes of well-meaning redistributive initiatives variable and sometimes problematic. want just to consider a rather concrete case here, which is the work of NGOs on the West Bank, the subject of a trenchant study very recently by Yara El-Ghadban and Kevin Strome in an article published in a book on Palestinian music that came out in 2013. On the face of it, this particular study is a fairly straightforward case of redistribution, of the resourcing of institutions in which Palestinian children and young adults can learn Western music alongside their own. The stranglehold exercised by the Israeli authorities have meant a chronic lack of facilities and public services across the West Bank. Cultural provisioning, greatly facilitated by UNESCO's recognition of Palestine on the 23rd of November 2011, has been an exception. The Palestinian state, lacking a properly functioning health system, nonetheless boasts a national conservatory, the Edward Said National Conservatory, with no less than 5 orchestras and a network of organizations like Kamanjati in Ramallah, all providing an impressively high level of both Western and Arab music training. They're supported by an equally impressive array of funding agencies, the Swedish International Development and Cooperation Agency, the Qatan Foundation, the Ford Foundation, UNESCO, the Dutch Prince Claus Fund, the German Regional Social and Cultural Fund for Palestinian Refugees and the People of Gaza, the Qatar Foundation, the Khalil Sakakini Cultural Center, and the German Aventis Foundation, which funds the celebrated West-East Divan Orchestra, conducted by Daniel Barenboim, bringing together young Israeli and Palestinian musicians. As El-Ghadban and Strome point out, the common terms of this funding are emphatic. Culture is routinely portrayed as a basic need, a manifestation of humanity. All of these in quotes here. Vital to the building of a society on principles of, and again I quote, coexistence, evolution, and dynamism, end quote, and thus capable of contributing towards peace. Some of the funding is tied explicitly to bringing Palestinian and Israeli children together in music. Nearly all of it puts a high premium on ideas of exchange, collaboration, and dialogue. Now, these projects are redistributive in the sense that they resource the poorer partners and thus create space where Palestinian and Israeli young people might do things together as equals, as fellow human beings. Much has been written about the assumption that only Western art music can assure the necessary degree of universality, of political detachment, and I don't propose to go into that. But I do want to underline, along with El-Ghadban and Strome, the instrumentalization of the idea of culture in this context, its conceptualization as a resource in the building of civil society and the pursuit of peace, and its orientation towards the rights of the individual citizen rather than the affirmation of collective identities. Musicians in the occupied territories today are obliged to acknowledge these terms if they are to find jobs as teachers, find funding for their own projects, and have their voice heard on the international stage. The consequences, political and musical, of this are not easy to determine, as El-Ghadban and Strome stress. They hold back from judgment, except to remind us that the terms of this funding on the West Bank share much with broader reframings and instrumentalizations of culture in neoliberalism, and are thus hardly value neutral. They note the disintegration of the Palestinian Authority's patronage and pedagogy systems built up during the First Intifada, the turning away from song and the embrace of instrumental music, and the growing consensus on the part of young Palestinians that music making is now first and foremost about peace and no longer resistance with a capital R. Clearly, though, these new ways of funding, institutionalizing, and talking about music in the service of peace on the West Bank have shifted the ground, created rifts with the musical past, and in the name of shared humanity, undermined the capacity of music to shape collective memories, identities, and thus claims, without which, ultimately, authors like El-Ghadban and Strome aver, a broader social justice in the region, on which a more fundamental prospect of peace depends, will constantly be deferred. So I think this is quite a neat and rather powerful little case study here to show some of the problems with the redistribution paradigm, with thinking about culture in redistributive terms. Some pictures whilst you take a momentary, well-earned rest from the sound of my voice. There's another way of thinking about social justice in ethnomusicology, which I'll simply label performative, and connect with the line of thinking running, in my reading at least, from John Blacking to Tom Torino. In an essay on the music of the Venda churches in South Africa under apartheid, John Blacking showed how the Venda way of singing Protestant Christian hymns, inflected by the Hocketing musical processes of the Chikona, the music and dance of Venda community tradition, enacted a fundamental process of affective recognition, a mutually supportive engagement of voices, bodies, and selves. In the face of the daily privations and humiliations of life under apartheid, Venda church music, apparently invisible or inaudible to the authorities, maintained a powerful vision of social justice, forged in the here and now, underwritten by the biblical reminder of deliverance and redemption. This, Blacking believed, would support black South Africans in their struggles under apartheid and beyond. More recently, Tom Torino has pursued a rather similar argument, one with its roots in his early field work amongst highland Aymara communities in Peru. For him, presentational practices in modern capitalist society contribute to the commodification, reification, and alienation of much contemporary musical experience. Various kinds of participatory practice, by contrast, involve non-hierarchical, leaderless, inclusive, group-oriented affect, sound, and thus political process, always at least potentially oriented towards social justice. More recently, the sound-making processes in New York of Zuccotti Park and the Occupy movement there, from the celebrated human microphone to the drum circles and the brass bands, have been discussed in somewhat similar terms. Sorry, I've skipped ahead in my slide a little bit here. So there are problems here with, too, with the kind of what I'm labeling the kind of performative way of thinking about social justice issues in ethnomusicology. One might start off with the well-known and much discussed Zuccotti Park problem, recently documented by Mark Grief, where the human microphone and the drumming circles came increasingly into conflict during the Occupy movement because important and pressing messages that the human mic system was trying to relay were constantly being interrupted by the drumming. So you're aware of what the human mic is here. It's a system for kind of passing messages through a crowd which don't require or use or are reliant on amplification. So there's a whole kind of social and semiotic protocol that grows up around how somebody wanting to address a crowd without amplification does through this kind of process of passing the message on. An object of great interest to people studying and thinking about the whole Occupy movement. But the situation here is one of this conflict that arose between the human mic and the drumming. The situation in Zuccotti Park was, by all accounts, apparently amicably resolved when the drummers agreed to move, just quite simply to move across the park and keep well clear of the human mic area. But this amicable agreement was forged, as Grief observes, at the cost of reinscribing organizationally precisely the kinds of communication, feeling, mind-body dichotomies that both sides agreed was itself undemocratic and that should have no place in the protest movement. And one might see this as an instantiation of the broader problem here, which is that pragmatically, or simply out of force of habit, when we put some kind of meta-performative wall around quote-unquote democratic music making, we introduce the possibility of containment, the sense that what is possible in music making may not yet be possible in political action, and thus the possibility of endless deferral, or perhaps even worse, a nostalgia which has simply given up on the possibility that it might change the present. But let me underline once again the key idea here, that here is a conception of social justice in music, and one close to the ethnomusicological tradition that brings together recognition and redistribution principles and ties it to the performative. Axel Honneth, the chief social theorist of recognition, argued a similar point in a spirited debate with Nancy Fraser about a decade ago, which I've already mentioned. Honneth chiefly took exception to Fraser's idea that the disembedding of economy from culture has introduced principles of global maldistribution that can no longer be met simply by principles of recognition. Fraser's charge in this debate is that Honneth wants to squeeze all social justice issues into a narrow and monophonic framework. But Honneth was at pains in this debate to show how recognition principles, in what he calls bourgeois capitalist society, were multicentric and differential. They were rooted, he argued, in three quite distinct institutional spheres: that of love, that of legal equality, and that of what he calls the merit principle, i.e. the principle by which people might be recognized for what they achieve, not rank or status. Love is important to Honneth. It's a category which usefully includes friendship. It may have the couple form at its heart, but is not restricted to it in his analysis. And it's a world not just of language, but of, as Honneth puts it, physical gestures and mimetic forms of expression. It's where, Honneth argues, we learn to recognize others as needy beings with particular force and intensity. But these are not neatly separated and separable spheres, which is where, incidentally, his theoretical framework differs from that of Niklaus Luhmann's otherwise rather similar-sounding theory of the four key communicational media: truth, love, money, violence, all of which tend to become more and more specialized and separate from one another. The moral schemes that take shape within Honneth's institutional spheres possess, he argues, a surplus validity, that's his term, a surplus validity, which ensures they spill beyond the bounds of their own particular and institutionally separate systems. Bear this in mind, please, as I return now to the question of sentimentalism and its relationship with social justice. I think two things might now be clear. One is that the social justice orientations of what I've been describing as the recognition, redistribution, and performative paradigms in ethnomusicology do not have within them very much space for the kinds of scenarios that have interested me in my attempt to grapple with, broadly speaking, the popular sentimental. In fact, in some ways, they rather explicitly exclude them. That is to say, the kinds of performative dissent that have interested me, ones that have mobilized through popular song in various social and political scenes, the affective on the small scale. They exclude them because the agencies involved, it seems to me, are considered, in ethnomusicology and elsewhere, are considered hard to define and locate. Their emotional foci are considered too diffuse. Their political imagery is considered too opaque. And their dependence upon mass-mediated, commodified, middle-brow popular culture is considered somehow problematic and disabling. If something has fallen into any of these categories, it's usually enough to describe it as sentimental, and for this to suffice as a means of explaining the failure of this music to be properly political, or to be interesting from a social justice point of view. So ethnomusicology, and I'd add popular music studies, have made it rather difficult to notice the kinds of things I've been intent on noticing in this broad project. It's also been part of my project to think about how exactly the sentimental, understood as small scaling, distributing and translating, might prompt an ethical vision and mobilize social justice claims. It's the small scaling that's the key, so I'll limit myself in wrapping up here to this. By small scaling, by trying to understand sentimentalism or use the word sentimentalism to talk about how we small scale emotionality, I've meant various different things, performatively speaking. And I'll mention just very telegraphically and in passing here, because time is running out, 3 things which constitute chapters in the book I'm working on at the moment. One concerns musical icons, in which emotion and emotion small scaling, the small scaling of emotionality is performed across the complex and ambiguous gap between face and voice. Here I try and show, with reference to the work of Alfred Gell about abductive agency, how images and sounds push listening and viewing subjects towards an account of the labor that has gone into the object, and with it some kind of narrativization of the collective's yearning for wholeness and for the justice that might bring this about. This is how and why figures as varied as Paul Robeson, Abdul Halim Hafez in Egypt, who I've studied earlier, and Neşet Ertaş, who interests me greatly in Turkey today, have been able to connect diverse feelings of discontent, frustration, humiliation, depression, and social exhaustion, and be so readily understood and mobilized as it were, the voice of the people. So that's one. A second concerns a rather different kind of small scaling in relation to scenes of collective mourning. I've been particularly interested in studying the mourning crowd. Here, crowds that are enacting their mourning process and bringing themselves into being through sentimental song. Not just sentimental song concerned with the small scale, for instance, numbers from musicals or songs associated with childhood or songs associated with traditional mourning, but with ways of singing them in crowds which, through fragments, engages the co-present whole, and thus a sense of how a wounded community might restore itself. So my case study here starts off with Liverpool Football Club's fans' history of singing You'll Never Walk Alone. This is a very good example of the kind of thing that totally interests me, of how sentimental, kind of collective singing of sentimental songs moves towards certain kinds of social justice claims. Thirdly, I've been interested in another kind of small scaling, which is forms of musical action focused on fragments of the city, specifically its diminishing public spaces. And my case studies here come from the place of music and song in the Middle Eastern protest movements, the so-called Arab Spring, the soundscapes of Tahrir Square, and more recently of Gezi Park in Istanbul. The formation, for example, of an ad hoc symphony orchestra to protest the Gezi Park plans in Istanbul was a way of performing, as it were, a miniaturization of the public sphere, to demonstrate its fragility, to demonstrate the current government's neglect of it, to argue that without attention to the small, a patch of green in a grey and polluted city, one will lose one's capacity to intervene in the large. So that's my third kind of area of case studies here, is the role of kind of sentimental small scaling in through music and through song in the protest scenes that have just been so enthralling and compelling in the squares across the Middle East over these last few years. At the heart of all of these social movements, I'm concluding now, for this is how I consider them, is a representation of emotional life on the small scale. And at the heart of this, I believe, is a narrativization of love. The core love narrative has a kind of hemistic structure. First hemistic, the lovers encounter difficulties, endure separation, overcome them, and enjoy togetherness. Second hemistic, the lovers encounter difficulties, endure separation, fail to overcome them, and live unhappily ever after. But at least we are reassured they have loved and in doing so become human beings. The narratives are usually saturated with religious imagery and ideology, a topic I sadly haven't had time to go into here. This alone guarantees an emotional and ethical charge and political meaning. And to the extent that they have been entangled with the American and European cults of sensibility, which became more or less global throughout the course of the 19th century, they are saturated with the ideals of equality in emotion, of affective citizenship, and mutual recognition within the nation state. Music figures in these narratives through various agencies attributed to the musician, or to song, or to musical instruments. It is, too, itself a vehicle for them, adding layers of meaning and providing cognitive traction, holding them in collective memory until they need to be deployed at a given moment. Critically speaking, we in the Academy have become distrustful of narration and, of course, of the idea of the human being. But the idea of narration, the love story, and a vision of humanity realized in love continue to animate, in my view, ethical sensibilities and a sense of social justice, and it would be a huge mistake to ignore it. My opening question was, how might music be considered a practice of compassion? I conclude on a note that has rather haunted me since I first started attempting to think all of this through. For music can, of course, be used as a technique for inhibiting compassion, too. As is by now well known, Anders Breivik set off on his murderous rampage in downtown Oslo on Utøya Island on the 22nd of July 2011, with his iPod set on a loop to play Lux Eterna, British composer Clint Mansell's music for the battle scenes in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. Breivik reportedly found the music, quote-unquote, incredibly powerful, and was convinced he might need something to drown out the screams of his victims if he was to complete his task. In the end, we learn he didn't, but he wrote about this anxiety and this precaution in his journal. Now, we might not be particularly clear about what the word compassion means, but I think most of us would probably agree that Breivik's vision of a nation violently cleansed of ethnic minorities and leftists, articulated in a deranged online monologue, its senses anesthetized to prohibit any kind of sympathy or empathy with suffering human beings, is pretty much the opposite of compassion. And we might ponder the precarious place of music in it. We have certainly all, I suspect, got used to thinking of music as a way of shutting other people out. Now, there's an obvious distinction to be made between putting in one's earphones to endure a tough commute on public transport, or to signal that you're not available for conversation, or to create a space in a noisy environment for private thought on the one hand, and acts of mass murder on the other. One clearly does not lead to the other. At least I sincerely hope not. But one might uncomfortably recognize a continuum of compassion withdrawal here, and growing habits of thought that connect music with forms of emotional regulation limited to the self, and about setting limits on the self, habits of thought that are, of course, driving the listening technologies, the audio technologies of the moment. Recall, if you will, that music in the form of a children's song, Children of the Rainbow, sentimentally deployed, was also the chosen performative form by and through which Norwegian protesters stated their defiant rejection of the values of the Breiviks of this world and demanded social justice at the city hall. Social justice meaning emphatically not punishment for Breivik, but a world in which the rage, anger, and resentment that drove Breivik would never again be possible. The final twist in my story here is, I think, an uncomfortable one. Music drives an affective individualism today that can easily become solipsistic and anesthetized. There is no guarantee that music will deliver compassion. Its compassionate meanings and performativities constantly need to be stressed, underlined, argued for. There's more than reflexivity here, the ongoing emotional monitoring of the emotional self or collectivity, which, as I've already argued, has long been central to such scenes. There is also an anxiety there, a fear that this is a battle which could be lost, that music's capacity to engender compassion might slowly but surely being eroded. And then what? I think many of my examples, both in the talk that I've just given and in the broader project that I'm alluding to as I go through, I think many of these examples speak of an anxious effort in these sentimental scenes to retrieve music's compassionate possibilities. To an extent, I believe we can contribute to that effort in the kinds of discussions that we can have in a great university like this on the banks of the Thames. As so often, as Marshall Berman put it, it's a case of learning to recognize the signs on the street and to figure out ways of engaging with them intellectually, conversationally, and politically. I want to offer my own thoughts, which you've given me the chance to express here in this inaugural lecture, which is a great, great pleasure and a great, great honor. I want to offer my own thoughts as some kind of contribution to that process. Thank you very much.